Hello, everyone. So, with the end of 2019 approaching and a new year sneaking up on us that's nice and round and divisible by 10, I've been hearing a lot of people make jokes like, see you next decade, or this is my last blank of the decade. And I feel like I should probably make this video explaining why that is false and why we actually have one more year to go before we can make these jokes. Now, if you ever heard people try to explain why 2020 doesn't mark the beginning of a new decade, you probably heard them say something along the lines of, it's because there's no year zero. And while that is the shortest explanation, I think it's necessary to explain why that means what it means. When you look at the math behind it, it's actually not at all complicated to understand, and it really just comes down to simple counting. I think the reason people are getting confused is because it's really hard to start keeping track of counts when you're thrown 2,000 numbers in. This is why I'm going to start at the beginning and kind of show you what the patterns are and where we are now. So on that note, let's say it's a little over 2,000 years in the past, and we're scientists. At this moment, we're not using our modern way of keeping track of time that passed because we haven't invented it yet, and we need to come up with something. In this moment, it's reasonable to just start counting years the same way that you would start counting how many sheep you have. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. You take these 10 years and you call it, let's say, decade 1. Notice that the year 10 needs to be in decade 1, or now the decade would only have 9 years in it, and deca means 10. So 10 is included in decade 1, and it goes from 1 through 10. Now once year 10 is over, the next decade can begin. So the next one begins at 11, 12, 13, 14, and then all the way down to 20. So decade 2 is years 11 through 20, including the year 20, for the same reason that the first decade included year 10. If 20 isn't included in here, you only have 9 years in this decade, which doesn't make up a complete one. You need this inclusive number at the end to be a part of it. Now let's move on to the next one. Same as before, we start at 21, 22, 23, and then all the way down to 30. And again, it has to include 30. 30 is the last year of its decade, the same way 20 was the last year of its, and 10 the last year of its. You can continue this pattern as long as you need to feel comfortable with it. What you'll end up noticing is that every decade begins with the years whose last digit is 1 and ends with a year whose last digit is 0. By ends, I mean that it is the last year that still belongs in that decade. This is important. Now that we have that down, let's jump back into the semi-present and a current generation that is trying to pick up where the previous ones left off. So years are slowly passing, and we end up in 2000. It's just ended, and so the next number in our count is, well, 2001, 2002, and then all the way until 2010. You want to notice the 2010, again, has to be included in this decade in order for this decade to be complete. If it is not, we only have 9 years, and that's incorrect. So from here, we get into the real present. The next year that we count is 2011, 2012, 2013, and then all the way down to 2019, and finally, to where we are now, 2020. The year 2020, just like all the previous years that end with 0, has to be included in this decade. Otherwise, we are coming up short by 1 year. To go back to what I said at the beginning of the video, the reason people say it's because there's no year 0 in their explanation is because if we started keeping count at 0 instead of 1, everything would shift by one number and will make our decades end with 9s instead of 0s. So if I did this, going from 0 all the way to 9 and then 10, you can see here that 0 to 9 makes up the first 10 years. so the first decade. And then 10 to 19 would be decade 2, and so on until we finally got to where we are now, and our decade would in fact be 2010 to 2019, which it isn't. If you think about it realistically, it doesn't make a lot of sense to start counting at 0. For example, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 would only lead me to believe that I have 4 fingers, when in fact, I know I have 5. So, in terms of keeping track of anything, you really want to start counting at 1. I think the main issue people have with this concept is that we tend to group numbers together by similarity. So it's strange to tell someone that the year 2000 belongs in the 90s and that the 1900s don't. But that's one reason that we try to use something as unbiased, like math, to keep track of these things. Our gut just isn't really good at telling us what's what. Thank you for watching, and please let me know if you don't think these explanations were helpful or if you need more details. Have a Happy New Year!